Few modern Americans know that their country once fought against Soviet Russia. This did not happen during the Cold War, but much earlier, during the most critical days for the young Bolshevik state, when the outcome of the Russian Civil War was still uncertain. At the end of 1918, when the world was just beginning to recover from the devastation of World War I, thousands of American soldiers found themselves in the icy tundra of northern Russia, waging a strange, obscure war against Lenin's army. This campaign was shrouded in secrecy, conflicting orders, and political uncertainty, which generated deep frustration among combat personnel. In the summer of 1918, young men from Michigan and Wisconsin, who formed the backbone of the 339th Infantry Regiment of the 85th Division of the U.S. Army, underwent intensive training at Camp Custer near Battle Creek. Most of them were just over 20 years old, and they were eager to contribute to the victory over Germany on the fields of the First World War. After completing basic training, the regiment went to England, where the soldiers were awaiting an early transfer to the Western Front. However, fate decreed otherwise. At that time, dramatic events were unfolding on the other side of Europe. Exhausted by the war and the revolution, Russia signed the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty with Germany, withdrawing from the war. This decision of the Bolshevik government caused panic among the Allies, Great Britain and France. The Eastern Front ceased to exist, and Germany could transfer hundreds of thousands of soldiers to the West. The British and French governments have developed an ambitious plan for intervention in Russia. The official goals were to prevent the seizure of the huge stocks of Allied military equipment stored in Arkhangelsk, and to rescue the Czechoslovak Legion, a formation of 40,000 Czechs and Slovaks who were cut off along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Unofficially, the Allies sought to overthrow the Bolshevik government and restore the Eastern Front against Germany. President Woodrow Wilson hesitated for a long time. American public opinion was against interference in Russia's internal affairs. However, under pressure from the Allies and fearing the spread of communism, Wilson agreed in July 1918 to a limited participation of American troops. He insisted that the role of American soldiers should be exclusively defensive, guarding military depots, nothing more. General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe, received a presidential directive and changed the orders for the 339th Infantry Regiment. Instead of France, the soldiers had to go to northern Russia. The main forces were joined by the 1st Battalion of the 310th Engineer Regiment, the 337th Field Hospital, the 337th Sanitary Company and several auxiliary units, about 5,000 people in total. At the end of August 1918, American soldiers boarded transport ships in British ports. Many of them didn't even know exactly where they were going. The rumors about Russia seemed too incredible. The journey across the northern seas proved to be an ordeal. An epidemic of Spanish flu broke out on the ships, the very Spanish flu that claimed more lives than all the battles of the First World War. On September 4, 1918, American transports arrived in Arkhangelsk. The city greeted them with a gray sky, a biting wind, and an atmosphere of chaos. British troops had captured the port a month earlier, but the Bolsheviks had managed to evacuate almost all military supplies, for the protection of which the Americans allegedly arrived. Thus, the official reason for the intervention evaporated even before the troops landed. The American soldiers found themselves under the command of British General Frederick Poole, who immediately threw off all the restrictions set by President Wilson. Instead of guarding non-existent warehouses, the Americans had to participate in active hostilities against the Red Army. Deployment on the fronts. The British command has developed an ambitious strategy for advancing deep into Russia in several directions. The goal was to link up with anti-Bolshevik forces in the east and south, and create a united front against the Reds. The American units were divided and sent to different areas. The 1st Battalion of the 339th Regiment set off up the Dvina River in the direction of the important Kotlers Railway Junction, 300 miles southeast of Arkhangelsk. Advancing by barges and steamships, the Americans took up positions near the village of Tulgaz, about 200 miles from Arkhangelsk. The 3rd Battalion moved by train along the Vologda Railway, seeking to establish control over this important transport artery. Other units were sent to the Varga River, a tributary of the Dvina River, where forward positions were located south of the city of Arkhangelsk. From the very beginning, the operation faced serious difficulties. The area consisted of endless forests and swamps intersected by numerous rivers. There were practically no roads, and supplies were carried out with huge interruptions. But the main problem was the rapidly approaching Russian winter. Already in October, the temperature began to drop rapidly. American soldiers, equipped for the war in Western Europe, were completely unprepared for the conditions of the Russian north. The British command promised to provide winter uniforms, but supplies were constantly delayed. On November 11, 1918, the day the armistice that ended World War I was signed in Europe, the American positions at Tulgaz were heavily attacked by the Bolsheviks. The Red forces successfully broke through the Allied defense line, but a bayonet counterattack forced them to retreat in panic on November 14, 1918. This victory came at a high price and was a turning point for the morale of the American troops. The soldiers began to wonder, if the war in Europe is over, what are they doing in Russia? There was no official explanation. The command continued to insist on the need to hold positions and even planned offensive operations. With the onset of the real Russian winter, the situation of American soldiers became critical. The temperature dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. The rivers that served as the main supply routes froze over. The Bolsheviks received reinforcements and supplies from the south, where the waterways remained navigable for longer. The living conditions on the front line were appalling. The soldiers huddled in primitive dugouts and peasant huts, suffering from cold, lice and diseases. Food often froze before it could be eaten. Frostbite has become a common occurrence. Medical care was extremely limited, and the wounded had to be evacuated by sledge hundreds of miles across the snowy tundra. The Bolsheviks launched an active propaganda campaign. Leaflets in English were thrown at American positions, urging soldiers to think about what they were fighting for. Propaganda hit the sore point. Many Americans really did not understand the meaning of their stay in Russia. The most dramatic events unfolded on January 19, 1919, near the village of Uspadinga on the Varga River. A company of American soldiers has set up winter quarters here, setting up defensive positions. The Bolshevik command decided to strike a decisive blow here. Heavy artillery training began early in the morning. Jenks died in what would become the bloodiest battle of the Polar Bear expedition, along with 40 other soldiers in a skirmish on January 19. Only 6 survived. Superior Red forces surrounded the American positions. Under heavy fire, the defenders were forced to retreat, abandoning the village. The retreat turned into a nightmare. Through deep snow, under continuous shelling, the Americans fought their way to the main forces. Many of the wounded were frozen in the snow. The total losses amounted to 29 killed, 58 wounded and 19 missing. The bodies of many of the dead remained on the battlefield, and it was not possible to evacuate them. The defeat at Uspadinga was a turning point. It became obvious that the small Allied forces were unable to withstand the growing power of the Red Army. Moreover, the very presence of the interventionists only strengthened the support of the Bolsheviks among the local population. After the January disaster, the morale of the American troops plummeted. The troops were described as completely overcome with fatigue. The soldiers openly expressed their dissatisfaction in letters home, complaining about the meaninglessness of their mission, the terrible conditions and the incompetence of the British command. Military families in the United States have launched a campaign to bring soldiers home. Newspapers published heartbreaking letters from the front. The congressman demanded an explanation from the administration. Public opinion turned decisively against the intervention. At the front, discipline began to crumble. The French units, which were supposed to replace the Americans in some areas, refused to move into position. This further demoralized the American soldiers, who felt abandoned by their allies. Captain Eugene Prince wrote a frank report on the state of the troops, indicating a critically low level of morale. Colonel James Ruggles in his report noted the complete uncertainty of the objectives of the campaign. The officers couldn't explain to the soldiers what they were fighting for because they didn't understand it themselves. Some units have made desperate attempts to find a way out of the impasse. The soldiers of Company A tried to establish contact with the Bolsheviks to conclude a local truce, but their letter was intercepted by the command. The incident showed how far the crisis of trust between soldiers and officers has gone. The climax came in March 1919. Private Bill Henkelman led a group of soldiers who issued an ultimatum to their commander. Either they were withdrawn from the front line, or they refused to follow orders. Almost simultaneously, the soldiers of Company 1 refused to return to combat positions after a brief rest in the rear. They barricaded themselves in the barracks, saying they would no longer participate in the fighting. Colonel George Stewart, the American commander, found himself in a difficult position. On the one hand, he understood the soldiers' feelings and even shared them. On the other hand, open rebellion was punishable by death during the war. Stewart held a series of meetings with the dissatisfied, trying to find a compromise. In his address to the soldiers, the colonel honestly acknowledged the uncertainty of the mission's objectives, but stressed that military duty requires following orders. He recalled the consequences of desertion and mutiny, but also promised to bring all the claims of the soldiers to the high command. Private Henkelman was arrested and tried by a military tribunal on charges of sedition and desertion. However, the trial turned into a farce. Even the judicial officers could hardly hide their sympathy for the accused. As a result, Henkelmann received a relatively lenient sentence, which was perceived as a tacit admission that the rebels were right. The events in Russia could not remain without Washington's attention for long. President Wilson, busy preparing for the Paris Peace Conference, initially ignored reports of problems with the expedition. However, mounting public and congressional pressure forced him to act. In February, the Minister of War announced that the withdrawal would take place at the earliest possible moment, when the weather in spring would allow. Given the conditions of the Russian north, this meant several more months of waiting. For the soldiers on the front line, this news was both a relief and a disappointment. The end of the torment was promised, but when will it come? The spring of 1919 brought new challenges. Melting snow has turned roads into impassable swamps. The rivers opened up, but navigation was hampered by the ice drift. The Bolsheviks increased the pressure, seeking to inflict maximum damage on the interventionists before they left. In May 1919, the long-awaited evacuation began. American positions were gradually transferred to the remnants of the White Guard formations and fresh British units, consisting mainly of unemployed veterans of the Western Front. The process took place in an atmosphere of chaos. Many Allied formations simply fled at the first contact with the Reds. In early June, the main part of the American Expeditionary Force in northern Russia sailed to Brest, France, and then to New York and home. For two-thirds of them it was the state of Michigan. During the withdrawal, AEF soldiers in northern Russia decided to call themselves polar bears and were allowed to wear a badge with a polar bear on their left sleeve. This name has become a symbol of the unique and tragic experience. The AEF in northern Russia was officially disbanded on August 5, 1919. During their stay in northern Russia, American forces suffered more than 210 casualties, including at least 110 killed in action, about 30 missing and 70 dead from illnesses, 90% of which were caused by the Spanish flu. When transports carrying veterans arrived at American ports in the summer of 1919, they were not greeted like heroes at all. The country was consumed by post-war problems and strikes. The story of the Arctic expedition seemed like a strange and inconvenient episode that everyone preferred to forget. The veterans of the expedition formed the Polar Bear Association, which first met at the Tulla Hotel in Detroit on May 29, 1922. The stated goals of the organization were to preserve and strengthen camaraderie among its members and perpetuate the history of our expedition and the memory of our dead. One of the main tasks of the Polar Bear Association was to return the bodies of dead comrades to their homeland. More than 100 American soldiers were left lying in the frozen land of Russia, in unmarked graves scattered for hundreds of miles across the tundra and forests. The veterans launched a persistent campaign to get the government to organize an expedition to search for and reburial the remains. They were supported by congressmen from Michigan, especially Senator Arthur Vandenberg, who called the veterans loyal and forgetful comrades of the fallen. An expedition under the auspices of the Veterans of Foreign Wars of the American Expeditionary Force successfully organized and conducted a mission to search for remains in the fall of 1929, which found, identified and removed the remains of 86 American soldiers. The remains of 56 soldiers were eventually reburied in the areas surrounding the Polar Bear Memorial by sculptor Leon Ehrman at Whitechapel Memorial Cemetery in Troy, Michigan, in a ceremony on May 30, 1930. The white marble polar bear became the eternal guardian of the memory of the forgotten war.